No note, no phone call, no goodbye. He was there every morning. Black coffee, no sugar, a forehead kiss. And then one day, simply gone. 6 weeks later, she found out she was pregnant. She gave birth completely alone. She worked 2 jobs. She skipped her own meals so her daughter could eat. She ran 6 blocks barefoot through winter streets to reach an emergency room because she could not afford a taxi. And the man who caused every single one of those nights of pain, he had no idea any of it was happening until now. This is a channel for stories that remind us what truly matters: loyalty, sacrifice, redemption, and the love that refuses to be buried no matter how long it has been hidden. Here's what this story whispers. Strength is not the absence of pain. It is choosing your child over your grief, every single morning, without anyone watching. Press like if Lena's strength moved you. Share this with someone who deserves to hear it. Subscribe and stay, because tomorrow's story is just as powerful.
Catherine Kensington did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Her voice became lower, speaking slowly and carefully. Each word landed like a cold stone on the marble floor. "What did you just say?" Her eyes narrowed, as sharp as a doctor's knife, looking Lena up and down from her cheap shoes to her pale face. There was no shock in her expression. There was only the cold thinking of a woman who had spent 40 years next to the most powerful mob boss on the east coast of America, a woman who was used to dealing with all kinds of threats. "I will ask one more time," Catherine said, taking a single step toward Lena. The scent of her expensive perfume drifted through the air, but her eyes were anything but soft. "What did you just say about my son?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat feeling as dry and rough as sandpaper. She understood she had just opened a door that could never be closed again. The words she spoke were still hanging in the air, heavy and impossible to pull back. "Ma'am, I know this sounds very," Lena started, her voice shaking, but she forced herself to keep it firm. "Sounds very what?" "Crazy. Desperate," Catherine interrupted her. And now her voice held something even more dangerous than anger. It was a cold, controlled disgust. "You have been in this house for less than 1 hour, and you have the nerve to stand before me and claim, 'My son, Jude Kensington, is the father of your child.'" She took another step closer. Lena wanted to back away, but her legs refused to move. "People who try to scam my family usually do not have happy endings," Catherine said, her voice as smooth as silk. But every word she spoke carried the weight of a judge's sentence. "I have seen all sorts of people show up at this door with all sorts of sad stories, hoping to get a few dollars from the Kensington name. If this is some kind of game, I suggest you walk away now, while I am still being polite." Lena could feel the real danger in that statement. This was not the kind of warning a rich lady gives when a rude maid steps out of line. This was the threat of someone who was used to giving orders, used to being obeyed, and used to seeing people who crossed her vanish from the game completely. But Lena had lived 27 years in a world without any safety nets. She had slept in a junk car when she was 16. She had delivered her baby alone in a city hospital with no one to hold her hand. She was used to being scared, and she knew the biggest thing to fear was not the powerful woman in front of her, but the truth that was burning inside her, begging to be let out. "I am not trying to blackmail you," Lena said. Her voice was trembling, but she kept her eyes locked on Catherine's. "I had no idea who you were until this morning. I did not know who this house belonged to. I only know that the man in that painting is the man I was in love with for 3 months, 5 years ago. He told me his name was Jack. He came into the cafe where I worked every morning and ordered a black coffee, no sugar. He would laugh when he told silly jokes. He would run his hand through his hair when he felt awkward, and he kissed my forehead every single morning before he left." Lena's voice cracked on that last word, but she fought back the tears, refusing to cry in front of this woman. Then one day, he was just gone. No note, No message. His phone number was disconnected, like he never even existed. She took a deep breath. 6 weeks after that, I discovered I was pregnant. I searched everywhere for him, but all I had was a fake name and the memory of a man I now realize was never the person he pretended to be. Catherine did not move a muscle. Her expression did not change at all. But Lena noticed a small shift in her eyes. It was not trust, not yet, but it was focus. The kind of focus someone has when they are truly listening, not just waiting for their turn to talk. My daughter's name is Phoebe, Lena continued, her voice getting stronger now, as if just saying her child's name was giving her strength in the middle of this storm. She is 4 years and 3 months old. I have raised her by myself from day one. Nobody helped, no family, no friends, no one, but me and my baby. I did not come here looking for my child's father. I came here because the salary is 3 times what I made at the cafe, and because my daughter deserves to have enough food to eat every single day. Lena paused, catching her breath. Seeing him in that painting was an accident. An accident I truly wish had never happened. The room fell silent. The afternoon sun streamed through the window and spread across the fancy Persian rug, casting long stripes of light on the wood floor. The clock on the wall ticked on, the only sound in the tense air between the two women. Catherine stared at Lena for a very long time. It was no longer a look of judgment, but the look of someone putting puzzle pieces together in her head, comparing what she had just heard with what she already knew, trying to find a lie in the story and failing. Then she turned around, walked over to the deep blue velvet couch, and sat down. Her back was still perfectly straight, but her shoulders relaxed just a little bit. It was just a tiny change, but it was enough for Lena to see a crack had formed in her tough exterior. Sit down, Catherine said. Her voice was still cold, but it was not sharp like a knife anymore. It had changed into something else. Something like the voice of a professional detective when she realizes the person she is questioning might actually be telling the truth. Start from the very beginning. Tell me every detail. Do not leave anything out. So Lena told her the entire story, every single detail. Rosie's Cafe in the South End, on the corner near the train station, the smell of fresh coffee every morning mixing with the steam coming off the wet streets. Jack, who she now knew was Jude, would always show up at 7:30 in the morning, not a minute early, not a minute late, like he had an alarm clock built inside him. He always sat at the same spot, the small table right by the window. He always ordered the same drink, a black coffee with no sugar. And he always looked at her with those gray-blue eyes when she brought him his cup. A look that made her hands shake so much that she almost spilled coffee on the table during that first week. Catherine listened without saying a word. She sat as still as a statue on the blue velvet couch, with only her eyes moving, scanning every single expression that crossed Lena's face, searching for the tiniest hint that she was lying. When Lena was finished, the room became silent again. Catherine got up, walked to a wood cabinet by the window, opened the second drawer, and pulled out a brown, leather-bound photo album. Not the kind you leave out for company, but a personal one. The leather on the corners was worn down, and the binding was a little loose. She set it on the coffee table in front of Lena without saying anything. Lena looked at the album, and then back at Catherine, unsure what to do. "Open it," Catherine commanded, her voice short. Lena opened the book to the first page, and she gasped. This was not the serious man from the oil painting on the wall. This was Jude as he really was. This was the Jude she had known as Jack. There was a picture of him on a beach in Cape Cod. He was wearing a white t-shirt and shorts. He was smiling, with his eyes squinted from the bright sun. The next photo showed him sitting in a bar, holding a glass of beer, his head tilted back a little as he laughed at something someone else had said. Then there was a birthday picture. He was standing in front of a cake. The light from the candles was reflecting in his gray-blue eyes. And that smile was tilted a little to the left, looking a bit shy, as if he was not used to being the center of attention. Lena stopped at the beach photo, her finger gently touching the plastic cover. That smile. It always tilts to the left, and the way he squints in the sun instead of putting on sunglasses. She turned the page and stopped at the picture from the bar. See here, the way he holds his glass, always with his left hand, even though he uses his right hand. And whenever he has a really big laugh, he throws his head back and then smooths his hair down because he gets embarrassed. A tremor crept into Lena's voice. My daughter does the exact same thing. Phoebe pushes her hair back when she gets nervous. She tilts her head when she laughs, and she is only 4 years old. She has these mannerisms she has never seen anyone else do because the one person who moves just like her was gone before she was ever born. Catherine remained silent as Lena flipped through the pages. But Lena saw the woman's hand, which had been resting calmly on her lap, was now clenching the edge of her jacket. Her knuckles had turned white. It was the only sign that revealed Catherine Kensington's real feelings. Then, she got to her feet, took her phone from her pocket, and dialed a number from memory. Brennan. Her voice was cold as steel again. I need you to run a background check. The name is Lena Ashford, 27 years old. I want every single detail from 6 years ago until today. Where she has lived, where she has worked, her medical history, everything. I want the report by tonight, she said, ending the call. She faced Lena again, her expression completely blank, as if the last 15 minutes had been nothing more than a standard business matter. You will go back to your duties now, Catherine instructed. Mrs. Patton is waiting for you in the east hallway. You are to finish your shift like normal. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, is to hear about this conversation. Not Mrs. Patton, not a single member of the staff, not a soul outside of this room. Lena stood up, her legs still feeling weak. She gave a small nod. Catherine moved in closer, so close that Lena could see the delicate veins on her hand, strained from being clenched for so long. And Lena, she said, using her first name for the first time, not girl or the new girl, but Lena. The way she said it had a heaviness that Lena could not quite understand. If that report shows that you are lying, about even the smallest thing, you will deeply regret ever walking through those iron gates. The rest of the afternoon felt like a long dream that Lena was trapped in. She trailed Mrs. Patton through the east hallway, half listening as the housekeeper went over the cleaning routine for every room. She explained which polish to use on the oak floors, which for the marble, and how to fold the bath towels into the fan shape the Kensingtons required. Lena nodded, committed it to memory, and repeated the instructions when asked. But her thoughts were miles away, bouncing between the oil painting and Catherine's icy expression and the stormy blue eyes she had looked into on her own daughter's face every day for 4 years. Are you feeling okay? Mrs. Patton asked after Lena had fumbled with the dustcloth for the third time in 10 minutes. You seem a bit unfocused. I am so sorry, Lena replied, scooping it up and managing a weak smile. It is just my first day. I am a little on edge. Mrs. Patton gave an understanding nod and did not push her for more. She was the type of person who sensed when to let things be, and Lena felt a quiet wave of gratitude for that. As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Patton brought Lena up to the second floor, to the master bedroom wing. This is Mr. Jude's room, she explained, swinging open a heavy oak door. He is away in London, but Mrs. Kensington insists it is kept perfectly clean, as if he might show up without warning. Lena walked in and the feeling in the air changed instantly. The room was huge, but it was surprisingly simple compared to the lavishness of the rest of the house. There was a king-sized bed with a dark wooden headboard, a pair of nightstands with only lamps on them, and a mahogany desk near the window that looked out onto the garden. On the desk sat a closed laptop and a picture frame that was turned face down. This was the room of a man who either did not want to leave any part of himself behind or of someone trying to erase him. Mrs. Patton told her to change the bed linens and dust everything, then went to check on another part of the house, telling Lena to finish her work and lock the door behind her. Now alone in the room, Lena moved carefully, like she was navigating a minefield. Her hands shook as she pulled the sheets from the bed, and when the scent from the pillow hit her, she had to pause, clutching the fabric with her eyes squeezed shut. Wood and bergamot. It was Jack's scent, the same one she had fallen asleep to every night next to him in their little Dorchester apartment. It was the scent she had desperately tried to find on her own pillows for months after he disappeared, until it finally vanished, forcing her to admit he was really gone. And here it was again, strong and fresh, as though 5 years had never passed. Lena made herself get back to work, change the sheets, dust, tidy up. When she got to the desk, she carefully wiped around the laptop and the picture frame, pretending to dust behind it. She picked up the frame. The photo showed Jude with his parents at what looked like a graduation. Someone was handing him a diploma. Catherine stood to his right, offering a rare smile, and a tall man with a severe face stood to his left, who Lena guessed was Raymond Kensington. But it was not the picture that made her heart stop. It was what was tucked behind the frame, a small, circular piece of cardboard with worn edges in a faded brown color. She knew what it was instantly, even before she flipped it over, because she had handled thousands of them during her 5 years as a waitress. It was a cardboard coaster, the kind they put under every coffee cup at Rosie's Cafe. The Rosie's logo was almost completely faded, but you could still just make out the drawing of the rose and the tiny letters underneath it. Lena turned the coaster over with fingers that were trembling so much she nearly dropped it. On the back was slanted handwriting in blue ink. Lena. It was her own handwriting. She remembered it perfectly, like it happened yesterday. It was the first day Jack had come into the cafe. She had scribbled her name on the coaster when he asked what it was, because the diner was packed and she had to run to other tables. He had saved it. From that very first day. For 5 years, he had carried it all the way from Boston to London and kept it hidden behind a photo on his desk, in a room he demanded be kept spotless, as if he could walk back in at any second. Lena put the frame back exactly where she found it, the coaster now in her palm, feeling weightless but heavier than anything she had ever held. She was standing in Jude Kensington's room, surrounded by the smell of wood and bergamot, holding a coaster with her name on it. And for the very first time, in 5 years, she let a thought she had pushed down deep inside finally come up for air. Maybe he did not want to leave. Maybe he was forced to. As the day ended, with the sunset painting the tall mansion windows a deep red, Lena was called to Catherine's office. This room was different from the main living area. It was smaller and more intimate, dominated by a large wooden desk and bookshelves that ran from the floor to the ceiling. Catherine was seated behind the desk. On it was a slim brown folder, the kind Lena knew did not come from a government office. She did not offer Lena a seat. She did not have to. Lena understood this was not going to be a pleasant chat. Lena Ashford, Catherine began to read, her voice flat and without any hint of emotion. She entered the foster care system at age 3, lived with 4 different foster families over 13 years, aged out of the system at 16, worked as a waitress at Rosie's Cafe in South Boston, from age 21 to 22, left her job because of a pregnancy. Daughter, Phoebe Ashford, was born at Boston Medical Center, currently lives at apartment 312, Maple Building, in Dorchester. Her yearly income is below the federal poverty line. She shut the folder. Everything seems correct. Lena remained silent. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the coaster, and set it on the desk next to the file. Catherine glanced down, saw the Rosie's Cafe logo, flipped it over, and read the name Lena in blue ink. For the first time since Lena had arrived at the house, Catherine Kensington's composure cracked. It was only for a moment, a blink that lasted a fraction too long, a slightly sharper intake of breath, a swallow she could not hide. But Lena caught it. "I found this in your son's room," Lena said quietly, tucked behind a picture frame. My name, in my writing. He has had it for 5 years. Catherine did not pick up the coaster. She just stared at it, as if it were the last piece of a puzzle she had been refusing to solve for half a decade. Then she settled back into her chair, her gaze drifting to the window where the Boston sky was shifting from red to a deep purple. 5 years ago, Catherine started, her voice now completely changed. It was no longer sharp and cold, but low and filled with a weight, like someone opening a box that had been sealed for far too long. Jude shut himself in his room for 3 days. He refused to eat. He would not talk. He would not open the door for anyone, not even for me. She looked back at Lena. When he finally came out, he said only one thing: I have no reason to stay here anymore. And then he accepted the offer to run the London office, a job he had turned down for 2 whole years before that. He was on a plane that same week and he has not been back. Catherine laid her hand on the coaster, her fingertips gently tracing the name Lena, probably the same way her son, thousands of miles away in London, still did every single night before he went to sleep. I asked Raymond, my husband, if he knew what had happened with Jude. He told me no. I believed him. She stopped for a moment. Now, I believe he lied to me. Looking straight into Lena's eyes, Catherine spoke in a way that Lena could not tell if it was an order or a desperate request. Bring the child to me tomorrow. If she has Kensington blood in her, I will know. The bus journey back to Dorchester felt like it would never end. Lena sat in the very back, her head leaning against the cold glass of the window, watching the blur of Boston go by without really seeing any of it. Streetlights began to flicker on, their yellow light smearing in her vision like stars falling backward. Inside her apron pocket, her hand was still gripped around her phone, as if it were the only thing that could prove that the day's events were real and not some terrible, waking dream. The bus pulled up to the corner of Maple and Adams. Lena got off, taking a deep breath of the familiar evening air in Dorchester. The smell of fried food floated from the corner store. From a fifth-floor window high above, hip-hop music poured onto the street. Kids were screaming with laughter over at the little playground down the block. Lena walked through the rusty iron gate of the Maple building and up 3 flights of stairs. The hallway lights flickered, looking like they were about to give out. She passed the spot on the second floor where the wall was peeling, a problem she had reported back in March that no one had bothered to fix. But the moment she opened the door to apartment 312, the world outside simply disappeared. Her apartment was small and crowded, but you could feel the presence of 2 lives in every corner. Phoebe's drawings were taped all over the refrigerator door. There were houses in crazy colors, flowers that were taller than people, and cats with wings flying through purple skies. A tiny pot of mint sat on the windowsill. It was the only plant that made it through the winter, all because Phoebe made sure to water it every single morning. The patchwork blanket that Dolly had sewn was draped across the old sofa. Every single square of fabric held a story the old woman told Phoebe on the nights she babysat. Mama. Like a little cannonball, Phoebe shot out of the living room. Her light brown hair was a mess. Her fierce, familiar eyes were shining, and one arm was wrapped tightly around Biscuit, her stuffed bear. The bear was worn down and missing an eye, but it was still her most prized possession. Lena fell to her knees and pulled her daughter into a hug, holding on so tight that Phoebe squeaked, "Mama, I can't breathe!" But Lena didn't loosen her grip. She breathed in the smell of baby shampoo in her daughter's hair and felt those little arms wrap around her neck. For the first time all day, Lena felt like she was standing on solid ground. Dolly stood in the doorway with knitting needles in her hands, watching them with a warm smile. She was a good girl today. We worked on counting to 100 in Spanish. "Thank you, Miss Dolly," Lena said, trying hard to keep her voice from shaking. Dolly looked over her reading glasses and said, "You look exhausted." "That first day working for the wealthy was tough. Tougher than I could have imagined," Lena admitted. It was probably the most honest thing she had said all day. After Dolly went home, Lena started on dinner. She made scrambled eggs and toast, the meal Phoebe loved to call breakfast at night, which always made her giggle because it felt so silly and backward. Lena sat at the small table pushed up against the wall, right across from her daughter, just watching her eat. And suddenly, she noticed everything. She saw the way Phoebe tilted her head when she chewed, which was the exact same way Jude did in that birthday photo. She saw the way she held her glass of milk with her left hand, even though she was right-handed, just like Jack did with his beer in the photo album. And then there was the dimple, that little dimple that appeared when she laughed. It was a feature Lena had always assumed came from some distant unknown relative. But now, it had a name, a face, and a portrait that was hanging on a living room wall in a huge mansion in Beacon Hill. Later that night, Phoebe was curled up on their shared bed fast asleep, with Biscuit tucked under her chin. Her mouth was slightly open, and her breathing was soft and steady. Lena lay next to her, but her mind was racing and she couldn't sleep. She took out her phone, turned the brightness all the way down, and opened her photo gallery. She scrolled back in time, past hundreds of pictures of Phoebe from the day she was born until now. She went past tired selfies taken after long night shifts, and past photos of instant ramen at 2 in the morning from when Phoebe was just learning to roll over. Then, she found them. There were 4 pictures, the only things she had left from the 3 happiest months of her life. The first one was a selfie taken in Boston Common when the leaves were changing color. Jack's arm was around her, and they were both smiling, with bright red maple trees behind them. The second one was of Jack standing in the kitchen of this very apartment, the same kitchen where she had just cooked eggs. He was wearing a striped apron with tomato sauce on his cheek, giving a sheepish grin after he had burned a pot of instant ramen. The third photo was blurry and a little shaky, because Lena had taken it in a rush. It was of Jack kissing her forehead in the rain at Faneuil Hall, with raindrops sparkling in his hair and his gray-blue eyes closed. The fourth one was the last one she ever took. It showed Jack asleep on her sofa with one arm tucked under his head, his face looking so calm. Lena remembered thinking in that moment that she wanted to wake up to that face every single morning for the rest of her life. Just 2 days after she took that picture, he was gone. Lena switched off her phone and just stared at the ceiling. The crack was still there, a zigzag line running from the corner toward the middle of the room. It looked exactly the same as it did almost 5 years ago, when she lay in that same spot, 7 months pregnant and all alone, with no idea what she would name her baby or how she would make the rent next month. She remembered all the nights she would wake up at 3 in the morning to feed Phoebe. Her eyelids would be so heavy with exhaustion, but she was too scared to fall asleep, terrified that her daughter might choke. She remembered when Phoebe was 8 months old and she had to go back to work while she was still breastfeeding. She would leave her baby with Dolly from morning until night. And when she came home, she would just hold her and cry silently as the guilt consumed her. She remembered the night Phoebe was burning up with a 104-degree fever when she was just 8 months old. Lena had run 6 blocks barefoot in the freezing cold night to get to the emergency room at Boston Medical Center because she didn't have enough money in her wallet for a cab. She sang lullabies the whole way, while tears soaked through her shirt. She hadn't cried once since that night. It wasn't because she was out of tears, but because she had learned that tears couldn't buy milk, they couldn't pay the rent, and they couldn't make a sick child better. She couldn't afford to be weak. Phoebe needed her to be strong. And now, tomorrow morning, she was going to take her 4-year-old daughter to meet a grandmother she never knew existed. She was going to walk into a mansion she could have never dreamed of, all to prove that the blood running through her daughter's veins connected her to a world that was a million miles away from apartment 312 in the Maple Building. The next morning, Lena got up early. She dressed Phoebe in her cleanest floral dress, and despite her fussing, combed her hair until it was neat. "Today, you are going to meet a lady at Mama's work," Lena explained, trying to sound as casual as she possibly could. Phoebe looked up at her, her gray-blue eyes wide with curiosity. "Does she have cookies?" Lena took Phoebe around to the back of the mansion, just as Catherine had told her to do the day before, making sure to avoid the main entrance. The slate stone path wound through the southern garden, where the last of the season's hydrangeas were still holding on to a faint, pale violet color before the heavy Boston winter finally arrived. Phoebe walked right next to her mother, holding Lena's hand with one of hers and Biscuit with the other. Her big, curious eyes were taking in everything around her with the kind of excitement that only a child can have. "Mama, this house is really big," she whispered, as if she was worried someone might overhear her. "Does a person live in all of these rooms?" "Yes, sweetheart," Lena replied, squeezing her daughter's hand a little tighter. The guest house was at the very end of the garden. It was a two-story building that was smaller than the main mansion, but it was still 3 times bigger than their apartment in Dorchester. Catherine Kensington was already on the porch, waiting for them. She was dressed in a perfectly fitted cream suit, and her platinum hair was pinned back so that not a single strand was out of place. Her back was as straight as a ruler, but she wasn't even looking at Lena. From the moment the mother and daughter appeared at the top of the path, her eyes were locked on Phoebe. She watched the little girl with a focus so intense that Lena could feel it from 20 paces away. Phoebe felt it too. She stopped walking, pulled on her mother's hand, and tried to hide behind Lena's leg, clutching her worn-out bear even tighter. "Mama," she whispered, blinking her gray-blue eyes. "She's looking at me funny." Lena gently placed a hand on her daughter's head, smoothing down her light brown hair. "It's all right, sweetie. She just wants to meet you." Catherine must have heard Phoebe's little voice, because Lena saw the older woman take a deep breath before she stepped down from the porch. She moved very slowly, with careful steps, as if she was afraid that any sudden movement might scare the child. When she was just 2 steps away, she stopped and lowered herself just a little. She didn't kneel, because Catherine Kensington didn't kneel for anyone, but she bent down just enough to be closer to Phoebe's eye level. "Hello," she said, and her voice was softer than Lena had ever heard it before. It was so soft that it was almost impossible to believe it was the same woman who had threatened her in the living room just yesterday. "You must be Phoebe." Phoebe just nodded, still hiding behind her mother's leg, but her curious eyes were peeking out from around Lena's hip. "Do you have cookies?" Catherine blinked once, and then a smile spread across her lips. Lena was sure that very few people in the world had ever seen that smile. "I do," she said. "I have lots of cookies. Why don't you come inside and I'll show you?" Inside the guest house, the sitting room felt much warmer than Lena had expected. There was a The room was set up with a comfortable sofa, delicate white lace curtains, and a coffee table in the middle. On the table, Catherine had arranged a tray of golden, fresh-from-the-oven cookies, a pitcher of apple juice, and 3 glasses, 2 large, 1 small. That careful preparation told Lena everything she needed to know. The moment Phoebe saw the cookies, all her shyness vanished. She looked to her mother, asking for permission with her eyes. Lena gave a slight nod, and Phoebe settled onto the edge of the sofa. She picked a single cookie, took a tiny bite, and her face lit up. "This is yummy," she announced with a huge grin. That smile revealed a deep, perfect dimple on her chubby cheek. It was an exact copy, identical in every way to the dimple in the birthday photo of Jude that Lena had been looking at just yesterday. Catherine's hand flew to her chest, her fingers twisting the material of her suit right over her heart. Lena saw her knuckles go pale. "Jude adored these when he was a boy," Catherine said, her voice shaking. It was the first time Lena had ever heard it sound so unsteady. The phrase, "when he was a boy," escaped her lips, carrying the weight of 40 years of memories. Mrs. Cook would bake a batch every Sunday. He always grabbed the most and stuffed them into his coat pocket to sneak upstairs. Phoebe was too young to grasp the history in those words, but she felt the kindness in the older woman's voice. She held out her half-eaten cookie as an offering. "Do you want a bite? It is really yummy." Catherine shook her head softly, though she never stopped smiling. Her eyes were moist with tears, and she made no effort to wipe them away. Maybe she could not. After Phoebe had eaten a second cookie, She became more confident. She started to explore the living room, feeling the texture of the sofa, looking closely at a vase on the windowsill. Then she remembered the little backpack she had brought with her. "Mama, can I show her my drawing book?" Lena's heart began to beat faster as she nodded. She knew exactly what was in that book. Phoebe unzipped her backpack and took out a well-loved sketchbook. Its cover was decorated with stickers of stars and cats. She climbed right onto the sofa next to Catherine, so naturally it startled both women, and opened the book. The pages were filled with a child's crayon drawings. There was a house with smoke puffing from the chimney, flowers as big as half the page, and a sun with a happy face. Catherine looked at every page, nodding and offering quiet compliments, until Phoebe turned to a specific drawing and paused. "This one is my favorite," she announced, with the seriousness only a 4-year-old can have. The picture showed 3 people holding hands. The shortest one in the center had brown hair and a flowery dress. That was clearly Phoebe. To her left was a taller person with long hair, Mama. To her right stood the tallest person, drawn with less detail, his hair short. He was positioned a little apart from the other two, as if the young artist was not quite sure where he belonged. "This is Mama. This is me. And this," Phoebe said, pointing to the figure on the right, "is Daddy." Catherine stared at the drawing for a long moment, then she looked at Phoebe. "Is your daddy very far from here?" she asked, her voice just a whisper. Phoebe gave a solemn nod. "Very far. But Mama says Daddy loves me. He just had to go to a place that is very far away." Catherine turned her gaze to Lena. All the coldness from the day before was gone. The sharpness, the suspicion, the scorn, it had all vanished. In its place was a complicated mix of emotions that took Lena a moment to understand. There was respect, because Lena had taught her daughter that her father loved her, instead of teaching her to feel abandoned. There was pain, because she was looking at the 4-year-old granddaughter she should have known since the day she was born. And there was shame, a profound shame that comes only from a guilty conscience, because she was finally realizing that her family had stolen something from this little girl that no amount of cookies or mansions could ever give back. Suddenly, the ring of a cell phone broke the silence. Catherine pulled it from her pocket, looked at the screen, and her entire expression changed. She stood up, muttered, "Please excuse me," and walked out to the porch, shutting the glass door behind her. Lena could still hear her voice, quiet but intense. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Fine. No, do not ask questions. Just get back here." When Catherine came back inside, her face was composed again, but a new kind of stress tightened the skin around her eyes. "There has been a change of plans," she said, looking directly at Lena. "Jude moved his ticket up. He is arriving tomorrow morning." Lena felt the world spin. Tomorrow morning, not over the weekend, not next week, tomorrow. "I am not ready," she said. The words came out before she could stop them, more truthful than anything she had said in the past 2 days. Catherine watched her for a long time, then glanced at Phoebe, who was now busy adding another yellow flower to her family portrait, completely unaware that her entire world was about to be turned upside down. "No one is ever ready for this," Catherine said, her voice quiet. It was not cold, but it was heavy, like the voice of someone making a difficult choice. "But my son has already lost 5 years. He should not have to lose another day." More than 5,000 miles away, in a 6th-floor suite at Claridge's in central London, Jude Kensington was sitting by the window, staring down at Mayfair at midnight. A light rain misted the glass, and tiny drops of water made their way down the pane, like wandering roads he had never taken. The whiskey in the glass on the marble sill was long gone, with only a faint amber ring left at the bottom and the lingering smell of peat in the room. Next to the glass, on the cool stone, was a small, round piece of cardboard with frayed edges. It was pale brown, and so old it was almost falling apart. A drink coaster from Rosie's Cafe. Jude picked it up, flipped it over, and looked at the handwriting in slanted blue ink. It was a little faded by time, but you could still clearly read the name, Lena. He ran his thumb over her name, very gently, as if he was afraid that if he pressed too hard, it would vanish. Just like the woman with that name had vanished from his life. No, not vanished. He had cut her out of his life himself and told himself he was protecting her. The door opened. Brennan walked in without knocking, a right he had earned after 10 years by Jude's side, spent in shadowy business meetings, through sleepless nights, and making choices that most men would never face. He noticed the coaster in Jude's hand, but showed no surprise. This was not the first time he had seen it, or the 10th, or even the 100th. "Boss, your mother called," Brennan said in a neutral tone. "She wants you to take an earlier flight tomorrow morning." Jude did not look up. "Did she give a reason?" "She did not say. Only that it is important and she needs you home right away." Jude stayed quiet, his eyes locked on the coaster. Brennan stood with his arms crossed, watching his boss with the kind of patience that comes from seeing too much. He let out a soft, barely audible sigh. "It has been 5 years, boss," Brennan said. His voice was not accusatory, just tired. It was the weariness of someone who has said the same thing over and over, always knowing what the response would be. "You should let it go." Jude finally raised his head. His gray-blue eyes, the same eyes that a 4-year-old girl an ocean away shared without his knowledge, met Brennan's with a deep sadness. "I have let go of everything else in my life, Brennan," he said, his voice quiet and measured. "I let go of my dream to be an architect when my father told me I had to take his seat at the director's table. I let go of the freedom to choose my own path the day I was born with the Kensington name. I even let go of the only woman who ever looked at me without seeing money or power or something to fear." His eyes fell back to the coaster in his hand. "Except for this. This is the one thing I cannot let go of." Brennan did not say anything else. He had figured out a long time ago that some arguments were not worth having, and the coaster with Lena's name on it was one of them. Jude stood up and slid the coaster into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, on the left side, right over his heart. It was the exact same place it had been for 5 years, through every board meeting, every stuffy dinner, and every long, empty night in his London suite. "Book the flight for tomorrow morning," Jude said. He walked past Brennan toward the closet and started to pack. Brennan nodded and pulled out his phone. But before he turned around, he took one last look at his boss. The most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast was folding shirts into a suitcase with the same hands that, just 12 hours before, had approved a $200 million deal. He wondered if destiny was playing some kind of twisted joke, or if something bigger was finally starting to happen. Now that Catherine Kensington had demanded her son come home, so him as Lena Ashford, not as the woman who cleaned his house. That night, Jude was staring at the same worn photograph he looked at every evening, but he had no idea. He didn't know that across town, in a tiny apartment in Dorchester, a woman was also wide awake, looking at old pictures and counting down the hours. And he certainly didn't know that in 12 hours, the past he fought for 5 years to forget would be standing in his family's living room. It would have his own gray-blue eyes, staring back at him from the face of a 4-year-old child he never knew existed. That morning, Lena decided against her uniform. She stood in front of the small bathroom mirror, studying her own reflection under the flickering light. She then turned away from the neatly folded housekeeper's uniform on her bed. Instead, she reached for a simple black dress, the only non-work item in her closet. She had bought it on sale at a thrift shop 2 years ago for a job interview she didn't get. The dress was old, but it fit her perfectly. The soft cotton moved with her, making her feel presentable without feeling like she was playing a part. She wore her hair down instead of pulling it back like she did every day. After one last look in the mirror, she walked out. If she was going to face Jude Kensington, she would do it as Lena Ashford, not as his housekeeper. The city bus dropped her off in Beacon Hill at 7:45. The second she walked through the huge iron gates of the estate, she could feel something was different. A polished black Audi was parked right by the main entrance, a car that was not there 2 days ago. He was back. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she could feel the pulse in her throat. She walked directly to the front door, ignoring the staff entrance she normally used. Mrs. Patton answered, her eyes widening for just a second when she saw Lena in the dress instead of her uniform. But the older woman said nothing, just tilted her head and moved aside as if she already knew this was no ordinary morning. Lena's low heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked through the foyer. She moved down the long hallway she had already memorized, passing by expensive oil paintings and giant crystal chandeliers. When she reached the double oak doors of the main living room, she stopped. She could hear a man's voice inside, deep and calm. Her whole body went cold, like someone had poured ice water down her back. 5 years. She had not heard that voice in 5 years and had convinced herself she had forgotten it. She was wrong. Lena knocked. "Come in," Catherine's voice answered. It was steady but tight, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Lena pushed the heavy door open. Catherine was sitting in her usual armchair by the fireplace, her back perfectly straight. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her knuckles white from the pressure. On the other side of the fireplace, a tall man in a gray suit stood with his back to the door. He held a coffee cup in one hand, while the other was tucked casually in his pocket. He was in the middle of saying something to his mother. His voice was warm and relaxed, the sound of a man who had just come home after a long trip, completely unaware that his entire world had changed while he was gone. And then he turned around. For a moment, time seemed to stop. It was those same unforgettable, haunting eyes. 5 years had etched new lines on his face, making him look harder, more tired. There were a few specks of gray in the hair at his temples, and his jaw was set, like a man used to clenching his teeth at night. But his eyes were exactly the same. They were the eyes she had looked into for 3 months straight, and the same eyes she had seen every single day since on the face of her daughter. The coffee cup in Jude's hand tipped, almost crashing to the floor. He managed to catch it, but hot liquid splashed onto his hand, scalding his skin. He did not even seem to feel it. His entire body had gone stiff. Only his eyes moved, widening and blinking fast, as if his brain was refusing to accept what he was seeing. "Lena," he whispered. The name came out hoarse, barely a sound at all, just a puff of air from a throat that had suddenly gone tight. It was as if saying her name had sucked all the air out of the room. Lena just stood there, her arms straight at her sides, her eyes locked on his. She had spent the entire night going over this moment, practicing exactly what she would say. But now, seeing him in person, all the prepared speeches disappeared. All that was left was the truth. "Hello, Jack," she said, her voice much calmer than she felt. Then she added, "Or should I call you Jude Kensington, the mafia boss whose real name I never even knew?" Jude placed the coffee cup on the fireplace mantel, his hand shaking so much that it clinked against the marble. He shot a panicked look at his mother. In that moment, the most feared man on the East Coast looked like a little boy who had just been caught. "Mother," he said, his voice cracking, "what is this?" Catherine did not get up. She did not even move. Her posture and expression remained completely unchanged. She just looked at her son with the calm eyes of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation for 2 full days. Then she spoke, her voice so calm it was almost cruel. She sounded like someone casually announcing the weather. It was as if her next words did not have the power to destroy everything in their path. "You have a daughter, Jude. She is 4 years old. Her name is Phoebe." A heavy silence fell over the room. It was not an awkward silence or a thoughtful one. It was the silence in the moment after a bomb has been dropped, but before it hits. That one last second where everything is still whole, even though everyone knows it is all about to be blown apart. Jude stared at his mother, then at Lena, then back at his mother again. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His right hand fumbled behind him until it found the back of an armchair, and he gripped it so hard his knuckles turned white. All the color drained from his face, so much so that Lena could see the faint blue veins on his forehead. And those gray-blue eyes, which just 12 hours ago had looked out over the city with a familiar loneliness, were now wide with an emotion that went far beyond surprise. It was pure, primal shock, the kind that makes your body forget how to work. "A daughter," Jude repeated, the words falling from his lips like heavy stones. "4 years old." Catherine gave a single, firm nod. "The woman standing before you is the child's mother. She came to work for us and recognized your portrait on the wall. I have spent the last 2 days confirming every detail. Her story checks out." Jude's head snapped back toward Lena, his eyes desperately searching her face for any hint that this was all some horrible mistake. Lena offered him no such comfort. She stood tall, her hands by her sides, and began to speak in a flat, cool voice. There were no tears, no shaking, and no begging for sympathy. "I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after you vanished," she said. "I tried to find you. The phone number you gave me was disconnected. Nobody at the cafe knew who you were. All I had was a fake name and a handful of memories. I gave birth by myself at Boston Medical Center. No one was there to hold my hand." She paused, not for emotional effect, but just to take a breath. "I have raised Phoebe on my own since day one. I worked 2 jobs a day. Some months, I could not afford baby formula, so I just skipped my own meals to make sure she had enough to eat. When Phoebe was 8 months old, she had a fever of 104 degrees in the middle of the night. I ran 6 blocks to the emergency room with no shoes on because I did not have enough money for a cab." Each sentence was like a knife, and Lena knew it. But she was not trying to be cruel. She was simply stating the facts, and the facts themselves were cruel enough. "I did not come here looking for you," she said, her voice steady. "I had no idea who you were until I saw that painting. I took this job because the pay is 3 times what I made at the cafe, and my daughter needs to eat. That is the only reason." At some point, Jude had collapsed into the armchair. He was bent over, his elbows on his knees and his hands clutching his head. His shoulders were shaking just slightly. When he finally looked up, his gray-blue eyes were red and watery. No tears had fallen yet, but they were all there, waiting. "I didn't know," he said, his voice completely broken. "Lena, I swear to you, I did not know. If I had known—" "What would you have done?" Lena asked. It was not a bitter question. She genuinely wanted to know. Jude looked at her, then stared down at his own hands, as if the answer was written on his palms. Then he began to speak. "My father found out about us," he said, his voice dropping low, becoming heavy like a man opening a tomb that had been sealed for 5 years. "Raymond Kensington does not like surprises. He had someone follow you. He knew everything. He knew where you lived, where you worked, what time you left, and what time you came home. Then he called me into his office." Jude swallowed hard. "He told me to end things with you immediately. I said no. The very next day you were fired from Rosie's." Lena flinched. She remembered that morning perfectly, the owner calling her into the back kitchen, refusing to look her in the eye as he mumbled something about staff cuts. His voice had been shaky, and she had believed him. She just thought she was unlucky, the next name to be crossed off a list. "My father bought the entire building that the cafe was in," Jude continued, forcing the words through his teeth, "just so he could have you thrown out. And he told me, 'This is just a warning. If you do not listen, the next step will not be so gentle.' I know my father, Lena. He does not make empty threats. He has the money, the connections, and the cold heart to do whatever he wants." His voice cracked completely on the last part. "I left because I was terrified he would hurt you. I thought if I disappeared, he would finally leave you alone. I thought that was the only way I could protect you." It was then that Catherine spoke, her voice quiet but heavy. "Raymond is from a different time," she said, looking out the window as the morning light streamed in. "For men like him, bloodlines are everything. Your social standing is everything. I am not making excuses for my husband. I just need you to understand that Jude did not make his choice under normal circumstances. Lena stood and listened. She took in every single word, every painful detail. Inside her, two powerful feelings were swirling, like two rivers that could never mix. One was the pure, simmering anger she had carried for 5 long years. Years. One part of her was furious with the man who had disappeared and left her to fend for herself. The other part understood, a painful realization that he had not left because his love faded, but because he loved her too much and was too scared. And that understanding was more painful than the anger ever was. You never gave me a choice, Lena said. Her voice was shaking now, truly shaking. The anger and the understanding were ripping her in two. You decided for me that I needed to be protected by being abandoned. You thought you were being noble by sacrificing yourself, but do you have any idea what your sacrifice did to me? To your daughter? Jude did not respond. He just looked at her, his gray-blue eyes filled with regret. It was not the shallow regret of a man who had been caught. It was the kind that eats you from the inside out, the kind that had been his companion every day and every night in that London suite, right beside the coaster that had her name on it. Phoebe, he said, and her name broke in half as it left his lips. Can I see her? Lena looked at him for a long time. She studied those tear-filled gray-blue eyes, the same exact eyes that looked up at her every morning from her daughter's face asking what was for breakfast. She studied the trembling hands of the most powerful mafia boss on the East Coast. She studied the man who had shattered her heart, but had also given her the most wonderful gift in her entire life. Yes, Lena said. But if you walk away again, Jude Kensington, I do not care who you are or how powerful you think you are. I promise you will not get a third chance. Jude drove with his eyes locked on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Lena sat beside him in the passenger seat, her hands resting in her lap as she stared out the window. Neither of them said a word. The city of Boston passed by them, from the brick streets of Beacon Hill to the wide avenues of downtown, before shifting into neighborhoods that were older, grayer, and more real. 10 minutes went by with only the sound of the engine and the faint honking of horns in the distance. 10 minutes where every single second felt heavy as lead, as each of them battled a storm inside their own head. Lena was the first to break the silence, not because she wanted to, but because the quiet was starting to feel suffocating. She likes to draw, she said in a soft voice, her gaze still fixed outside the car. Just like you. Jude glanced over at her for the first time since they had left. Like me. You would not know, Lena answered. But Phoebe draws houses all day long, every kind you can imagine. Houses with gardens, houses with chimneys, houses with balconies full of flowers. She draws houses so much. Her preschool teacher asked me once if I was an architect. She took a breath. She draws houses as if she is looking for a place to belong but has not found it yet. Jude remained silent. He turned his attention back to the road, but Lena could see his jaw clench, a muscle twitching just under the skin. When the Audi made a turn onto Maple Street, he slowed the car down. He looked through the windshield at the building, at the rusted iron gate, the cracked concrete steps, and the stained outside wall covered in graffiti. Laundry lines were stretched between balconies on the 4th floor. This is where his daughter lived. This is the place where, while he was sitting in a luxury suite at Claridge's looking down at Mayfair, Phoebe was sleeping in a tiny apartment, sharing a bed with her mother, and holding a worn-out stuffed bear named Biscuit. I am not feeling pity, Jude said quietly as he switched off the engine, his eyes still on the building. I am ashamed. Lena did not reply. She just opened her door and got out of the car. Jude followed her. They walked up 3 flights of stairs in silence, passing flickering lights in the hallway, peeling plaster on the walls, and the smell of fried food coming from an apartment on the 2nd floor. Jude did not complain or even flinch. He just watched, his eyes taking in every single detail, calculating every single thing his daughter had gone without for 4 years because of his choice. Lena knocked on the door to Dolly's apartment. It swung open, and before Lena could even say a word, a small brown-haired blur shot out. Mama! Phoebe threw her arms around her mother's leg, her face tilted up, her gray-blue eyes sparkling. Then she noticed Jude. She froze, tilting her head to one side, the exact same way Jude did when he was figuring out a situation, the exact same way she had tilted it when she looked at Catherine. Her curious eyes traveled from his polished leather shoes all the way up to his face, finally stopping at his eyes. Two identical pairs of eyes met, like a mirror reflecting two different worlds. Then Phoebe ducked behind her mother's leg, squeezing the one-eyed bear even tighter. Mama, she whispered, I do not like strangers. Lena placed a gentle hand on her daughter's head. It is all right, sweetheart. She looked over at Jude, and he understood immediately. He took one step back, and then another, giving the little girl some space. He did not move forward, and he did not squat down to try and force a conversation. He did not do what an impatient adult might have done. He just stood there and waited. In Dolly's living room, a small drawing table was set up in the corner. Phoebe went back to her usual spot, got out her crayons, and started to draw, acting as if Jude was not even there. Jude looked at Lena for guidance. She gave a very slight shake of her head, which meant do not push it. He nodded, and then he did something Lena did not expect at all. He pulled a small chair over, sat down at the table next to Phoebe, took a clean sheet of paper and a couple of crayons, and started to draw. He did not say anything, did not even look at her. He just drew. It was a house, with clean lines and perfect proportions, a porch with columns, wide windows, and steps leading up to the door. He drew with a crayon on white paper, a mafia boss sitting on a tiny plastic chair in a Dorchester apartment, sketching the most beautiful house that crayons could possibly create. Phoebe glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. She tried to ignore him, but the curiosity of a 4-year-old was stronger than her shyness. She looked again, and then again. Finally, she stopped pretending and just stared openly. "Whose house are you drawing?" she asked, her voice still cautious but also curious. Jude looked up at her gently. "I do not know yet. I just like drawing houses." "I like drawing houses too," Phoebe said. And with that, the first bridge between a father and his daughter was built, a connection as light as air, but stronger than any contract Jude had ever signed. She scooted her chair a little closer, and then a little closer still. She opened her sketchbook, turned to a page, and put it on the table between them. It showed 3 figures, holding hands. Mama, Phoebe, and a third figure standing a little bit away from them, drawn simply, with short hair. "Who is this?" Jude asked. His voice was almost a whisper. "That is my daddy," Phoebe replied with a serious look. "Mama says, Daddy went far away, but I still draw Daddy." Jude turned his head away. His shoulders were visibly shaking, and Lena, who was standing in the corner, saw him quickly lift a hand to his eyes as if he were wiping away sweat. But it was not sweat. The toughest mafia boss on the East Coast was crying over a crayon drawing made by a 4-year-old child. Then Phoebe added softly, with the kind of blunt honesty that only children have, "Tommy has a daddy. Maya has a daddy. Everybody has a daddy." She looked down at her drawing. "I do not." A heavy silence filled the room, so thick you could barely breathe. And then Phoebe did something that no one saw coming. She carefully tore the drawing out of her sketchbook, smoothed it out on the table, and held it out to Jude with both of her tiny hands. "For you," she said in a serious tone, "because you look sad." Jude took the paper with both of his hands. These were hands that had signed million-dollar deals, that had held steady through life and death negotiations, that controlled an entire underground empire. Now, they were holding a thin piece of paper with crayon on it, as if it were the most fragile and valuable thing he had ever touched. "Thank you," he said, and his voice completely cracked on those 2 words. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me." On the ride back in the black Audi, the drawing lay on Jude's lap. He was completely silent for 5 whole minutes. Lena did not say anything either, giving him the quiet time she knew he needed. Then Jude finally spoke, his voice low and firm. It was no longer broken, but strengthened by something new, something tougher than steel and deeper than regret. "I have lost 4 years," he said, his eyes fixed on the road in front of him. "I will not lose another day." Jude was true to his word. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day after that. A month went by, and Jude Kensington never missed a single visit. He was never a minute late, even if it meant leaving a board meeting early, rescheduling a transatlantic call with his London partners, or fighting through Boston's rush-hour traffic just to get to the Dorchester apartment at 4 o'clock, exactly when he promised. At first, Phoebe still called him Uncle Jude and kept him at a careful arm's length, always keeping Biscuit positioned between them like a little shield. But children have their own ways of knowing if someone is sincere, and their instincts are more accurate than any test adults could create. Phoebe's test was patience. It was in the way Jude never tried to make her talk when she wanted to be quiet, in how he always sat on the floor instead of a chair so they could be at the same eye level, and in how he remembered that she liked purple crayons more than blue ones, and that Biscuit needed his own seat whenever they had cookies. Slowly but surely, the distance between them got smaller. The worn-out stuffed animal was no longer a barrier, but a friend they shared. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Jude was sitting cross-legged on the old rug of the Dorchester apartment, wearing a $3,000 suit and playing with Phoebe and a plastic toy tea set. The quiet guest of honor, Biscuit, sat in his own seat with a pink plastic cup placed in front of him. Phoebe poured pretend tea into Jude's cup with the seriousness of a perfect hostess. "Here is your tea," she said. "No sugar, because you said you do not like sugar." Jude took a sip from the pink plastic cup with the same serious look he had when he signed contracts in front of a board of directors. "It is excellent," he said. "You make better tea than Brennan." Phoebe started laughing, a bright laugh that made deep dimples appear in her cheeks. Lena stood in the kitchen doorway, holding her coffee mug and biting her lip hard to keep all the emotions rising inside her from spilling out. And then that day, it happened on a completely ordinary Saturday afternoon, a day that felt just like any other. Jude had taken Phoebe and Lena to the grocery store because Phoebe was determined to get a sugary chocolate cereal, the kind her mom never bought because it was too expensive. They were walking down the aisle, with Phoebe sitting in the shopping cart, her little legs swinging as she studied the colorful boxes on the shelves. She finally spotted it on the very top shelf, the box with the cartoon rabbit she loved, far too high for her or even Lena to reach. Without a moment's hesitation, Phoebe turned to the tallest person nearby and said, "Daddy, get that for me." Jude froze right there in the middle of the aisle. His hand was already reaching up toward the box, but he just stopped, suspended in midair like a statue. Lena saw his eyes fill with tears instantly. It happened so fast that she knew he had no time to put up his defenses, or his usual tough guy mask. There he was, in a busy supermarket, holding a cereal box with a rabbit on it, his eyes glistening, while the word "Daddy" echoed in his mind. It was a sound he hadn't even realized he'd been waiting his whole life to hear. "Daddy," Phoebe said again, confused about why he had stopped moving. "I want that one." Jude swallowed hard, blinked, and put the box into the cart. "Here you go, princess," he said. His voice was a little shaky, but the smile that spread across his face was the biggest Lena had ever seen on him. Meanwhile, back at the Beacon Hill mansion, Catherine Kensington was going through her own transformation. Every weekend, Phoebe would visit the estate, and the powerful matriarch who had helped run a criminal empire for 40 years would sit on the living room floor playing with her granddaughter's dolls. She taught Phoebe how to sculpt with clay and told her stories about what Jude was like as a little boy. For the first time in ages, the sound of a child's laughter filled rooms that had long been shrouded in the heavy silence of secrets and power. Brennan was the first one to notice the change in his boss. One evening, Brennan was waiting by the car as Jude left the Dorchester apartment after putting Phoebe to bed. He watched his boss walk toward him with a smile still lingering on his face. "You are different, boss," Brennan remarked. Jude just looked at him. "It is the way you smile," Brennan explained, sounding more astonished than critical. "I have worked for you for 10 years. I have never seen you smile like that." Jude did not reply, but he knew Brennan was right. He started to turn down certain meetings, the kind that were never on any official schedule. The ones held in the basements of restaurants or the back rooms of private clubs, the kind he used to never miss. He began to delegate his responsibilities one by one, like a man carefully taking apart a tower he had spent 15 years building. He was dismantling it slowly and carefully from the top down, but with absolute certainty. And on the refrigerator in the Dorchester apartment, in the most prominent spot, was Phoebe's latest drawing, held up by a flower-shaped magnet. It showed 3 people holding hands. Mama was on the left, Phoebe was in the middle, and on the right was Daddy. For the first time, he was not a distant figure in a corner or a faint outline at the edge of the page. Daddy stood right beside them, holding his daughter's hand and holding Mama's hand. He was drawn large and clear, colored in with the darkest black crayon in the box. It was as if Phoebe wanted to make absolutely sure that this time her daddy would not disappear. The picnic was Jude's idea. He brought it up on a Friday night as the 3 of them sat on the floor of the Dorchester apartment, eating pizza because their table was too small for all of them. Phoebe announced it was the best pizza party of her entire life, even though it was just a $12 pizza from the corner place. "The weather is supposed to be nice tomorrow," Jude said, looking over at Lena. "Walden Pond, just the 3 of us, if you agree." Lena paused for a moment. This would be the first time they had ever gone out together as a family, not within the comforting safety of the apartment or the protected grounds of the mansion, but out in the real world where anyone could see them and think they were just an ordinary family. "All right," she agreed. On Saturday morning, their black Audi left Boston and headed west. Phoebe was in the new car seat Jude had bought the week before, a cookie in her lap, talking nonstop. She told them all about a boy at her preschool named Tommy who had lost a front tooth. She talked about her teacher, Miss Teresa, who was showing her how to paint butterflies with her fingers. She explained how her doll, Dolly, was knitting a wool hat for her stuffed bear Biscuit because winter was coming and bears get cold too. Daddy Jude drove, glancing in the rearview mirror to watch his daughter. He answered all her questions, nodded at all the right moments, and pretended to be surprised whenever the story called for it. And Lena sat in the passenger seat, watching both of them in that same mirror, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that she was afraid to give a name to. Then, right in the middle of her story about the butterflies, Phoebe suddenly asked, as casually as if she were asking about the weather, "Daddy, why were you not with Mama from the very beginning?" A sudden silence filled the car, thick and heavy. Lena felt like she could not breathe. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat. In the mirror, she saw Jude's hands tighten on the steering wheel. He clenched his jaw, but he did not avoid the question. He did not change the subject or say, "You will understand when you are older," like most parents would. "Because Daddy did something very wrong," Jude said, his words slow and measured, as if he were walking on thin ice. "Daddy thought that going away would protect Mama, but it only made her sad instead. And because of that, Daddy lost a lot of time with you." Phoebe was quiet for a few seconds, processing his words in that special way only a 4-year-old can. Then she said, "But Daddy is here now." "Yes," Jude replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Daddy is here now, and Daddy is not going away again." "Right, never. Pinky promise." Jude looked into the rearview mirror. Phoebe was holding up her tiny little finger with great seriousness. As if it were the most sacred promise in the world, he reached his right hand back, and her small finger hooked around his. His larger, rougher finger wrapped around hers, with a gentleness that only a father has for his child. "Pinky promise," Jude said. Walden Pond on an autumn morning was so beautiful it looked like a painting. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the bright blue sky and the trees that were changing from green to gold and fiery red. The air was crisp and cool and carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. They spread out Dolly's patchwork quilt under a large oak tree near the water's edge and set out the food Jude had picked up from a deli on the way. There were sandwiches, fruit, juice, and a box of cookies that Phoebe insisted on bringing because, as she said, "These are the best ones, the ones Grandma Catherine gives me." After they ate, Phoebe got out the watercolor set Jude had given her the week before and sat at the edge of the blanket to paint the lake. She was completely focused, her head bowed and her tongue sticking out a little in concentration. The two adults leaned against the trunk of the oak tree, their shoulders close but not quite touching, as they watched her. "Lena," Jude said, and his voice was different now. He was not Daddy talking to his daughter anymore. He was a man speaking to the woman he loved, his voice low and trembling just slightly. "I want a second chance." Lena did not look at him. She kept her eyes on Phoebe, who was mixing blue and white paint to get the color of the water just right. "Not just because of Phoebe," Jude went on, "although she is the most important reason. It is because of us. Because whatever we had between us, it never really went away." He paused, then added quietly, almost to himself, "5 years, Lena. 5 years. I kept the coaster with your name on it in my inside jacket pocket. I carried it from Boston to London and put it on my nightstand every single night. Brennan says I am crazy." He offered a sad little smile. "Maybe I am. But I met a lot of people in those 5 years, and not one of them, not a single one, was you." Lena finally turned and looked at him. His grayish-blue eyes met hers with complete and total honesty. The Mafia boss armor was gone, and so were the fortress walls. It was just the man she had fallen in love with 5 years ago, sitting under an oak tree by a lake, asking for another chance. "I am scared," she said, with more honesty than she had ever used before. "I am scared of your world, Jude. It is dangerous. It took you away from me once. It could take you away again, or even worse, it could hurt Phoebe." Jude did not argue with her. He did not make any grand promises or offer empty reassurances. He simply said, "Do not believe my words. Watch what I do. I will prove it to you every single day." Before Lena could say anything, Phoebe ran over to them, holding up her painting, which was still a little wet. Her eyes were shining with pride. "Look," she exclaimed, holding it up between them. It showed a blue lake and red and gold trees, and right in the middle, 3 figures stood side by side at the edge of the water. This was not like her old drawings, with Daddy far off in the corner. This time the 3 of them stood shoulder to shoulder, above their heads, in clumsy letters. Phoebe had written a single word she had just learned: family. Lena gazed at the drawing, then at her daughter, then at Jude. She placed her hand over his, a slow and gentle gesture filled with certainty. It was the first time in 5 long years she had initiated contact. "One step at a time," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. Together was the unspoken promise. Jude turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. They sat beneath the oak tree, watching Phoebe chase a late autumn butterfly toward the lake. The drawing of their family rested between them on the blanket. On the ride home, Phoebe drifted to sleep in the back, a biscuit tucked beneath her chin, her lips slightly parted as she breathed. The Audi moved smoothly down the highway as Boston appeared on the horizon, painted in the violet and red of twilight. Lena and Jude's hands stayed joined over the center console. Nobody said a word. They did not need to. For the first time in 5 years, the silence between them was not heavy with loss or anger. It was a silence of peace, the quiet comfort of two people who had finally rediscovered their way back to one another in the week following the picnic. Everything was so perfect that Lena started to feel a flicker of fear. Not the old fear of hardship or being alone that she was so used to, but a new fear of being happy. She was afraid because every morning the sound of the doorbell made Phoebe race to the door, yelling, "Daddy!" before launching herself at Jude's legs like a tiny rocket. Her smile was enormous. Lena understood that if that smile was ever erased, it would shatter Phoebe in a way that 4 years without a father never could. This time, she would understand exactly what she was losing. She was afraid because every morning, Lena made coffee for Jude, black with no sugar, and placed it on the kitchen table. He would take the first sip and look at her with those gray-blue eyes that had captured her 5 years ago, and she knew she was falling for him all over again. She was afraid because Catherine Kensington, the formidable matriarch, had invited all three of them for dinner in the main dining room of the Beacon Hill mansion. It was not in the guest house or a hidden corner, but at the head table where every important family dinner had taken place for half a century. Phoebe sat in a high chair Catherine had bought just for her, with Biscuit sitting on the seat next to her because she insisted the bear needed his own spot. And Catherine did not raise a single objection. It was an act of acceptance, more powerful than any formal announcement. Everything was wonderful, and Lena was terrified because life had taught her that beautiful things never last. That is when she noticed the SUV. The first sighting was on Tuesday when she was picking Phoebe up from Pequeno Sol's preschool. A black SUV with dark-tinted windows was parked across the street, about 30 meters from the gate. Lena did not think much of it at first. Boston had plenty of black SUVs. But on Thursday, when she came back, the exact same vehicle was there. It was in the same spot, with the same license plate. This time, the driver's window rolled down just enough for Lena to see a man's face staring directly at the preschool gate, right where Phoebe was running out, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. Lena squeezed her daughter's hand tighter and began walking much faster, her heart hammering against her ribs. Maybe it was just her imagination. Perhaps it was another parent just waiting. But the survival instinct she had developed over 27 years without a safety net was screaming that something was terribly wrong. That evening, Dolly knocked on her apartment door. The warm smile Lena usually saw on her 68-year-old neighbor's face was gone, replaced by a look of deep concern. "Someone was asking questions today," Dolly said in a low voice. "While you were at work, a man in a suit with perfectly combed hair came by. He was very polite, but it was the fake kind of polite. He asked where the little girl went to school, what time you picked her up, and if anyone else ever came to get her." The color drained from Lena's face. "What did you say to him?" "I told him I had no idea," Dolly answered, her eyes sharp. "I have lived long enough to spot trouble when a stranger starts asking questions." Lena locked the door and then checked it a second time. She peeked into the bedroom where Phoebe was sleeping soundly with Biscuit, then she grabbed her phone and called Jude. He was there in less than 15 minutes. But the man who walked into her Dorchester apartment that night was not Daddy Jude. He was not the man who would sit on the floor and drink imaginary tea from a little pink cup. This man was different. His face was cold, his jaw was set, and his gray-blue eyes had hardened into something like steel forged in a fire. This was Jude Kensington, the boss. He was the man the entire East Coast knew better than to challenge. He listened without interruption as Lena explained every detail, from the SUV to the man questioning Dolly. Then he made one phone call to Brennan. "Check it. Black SUV, tinted windows, near Pequeno Sol's preschool on Adams. I am sending you the license plate. Find out who is asking about my daughter." His voice was not loud, but every word carried a weight that sent a chill down Lena's spine. It was not a fear of him, but a fear of the world he was a part of, a world that was now reaching its grimy hands toward her child. The information came in before midnight. Brennan called back, and the tension in his voice was obvious. The men belonged to Vincent Corsetti, a rival from New York who was trying to gain leverage over Jude for new territory. They had found out that Jude had a daughter and a former lover. They saw a weakness, a pressure point. A 4-year-old girl and an orphan from Dorchester, with no one to protect her, were the perfect targets to exploit. Lena overheard Jude talking to Brennan on the phone. She did not recognize all the terms they used, but she understood enough to know that her daughter had just become a pawn in a game between powerful criminals. A rage, stronger than any fear she had ever known, began to build inside her. "This," Lena said, her voice shaking with fury, not fear, after Jude hung up and faced her. "This is why I was afraid. This is exactly what I warned you about at the lake. Your world is dangerous, and you have dragged us right into the middle of it." "Lena, Phoebe is 4 years old," she whispered fiercely, mindful of her daughter sleeping in the next room, but her voice was as sharp as a knife. "4 years old, Jude. And now someone is watching her, asking questions about her, and knows where her school is and what time I get her. All because of you. Because of the Kensington name and the empire you command." She took a step back from him, and that single step created a gulf wider than the physical space between them. "My daughter is not a pawn in your war, Jude Kensington. I have spent my entire life on my own, and I can do it again. I will take Phoebe and leave Boston if that is what it takes. I have been running my whole life. I know how to disappear." Jude did not say, "I will take care of it," or "Trust me." He did not offer any of the hollow promises Lena had heard from so many others. He just looked at her, his gray-blue eyes as cold and hard as stone, gave a single nod, and walked out of the apartment. After the door shut behind him, Lena stood alone in the living room, her hand pressed against her chest. She listened to his footsteps fade down the old staircase, having no idea that in the next 12 hours, Jude Kensington was about to tear down everything he had spent 15 years building. The first call he made was the second he got into his car. He did not call Brennan. He called Vincent Corsetti directly. Brennan, who was driving, stared at him as if he had gone mad when he heard Jude speak into the phone with a chilling calmness. "Vincent, this is Jude Kensington. That South Boston territory deal you wanted? It is yours. I am giving you all of it. I have only one condition. My family is off limits. Starting right now, if any of your men even get close to my daughter or her mother again, this will no longer be a negotiation. It will be a war, and you know I never bluff." Corsetti agreed. Of course he agreed. The South Boston deal was worth tens of millions of dollars, and he had just won it without a single conflict. But Jude was not finished. His second call was to Daniel Whitfield, a corporate lawyer, not a mob attorney. He was not the kind of lawyer who buried secrets in legal jargon, but the type who wore crisp white shirts and worked in glass offices downtown, handling legitimate business transfers. "Daniel, I need to meet with you right now, tonight. I want to sign the papers to transfer all unofficial operations of Kensington Holdings to the Executive Council. Everything." The silence on the other end of the line was long enough for Jude to know Daniel was trying to figure out if he had heard him correctly. "Are you certain? We are talking about the entire network." "All of it." Brennan drove him to the law firm. He was silent the entire trip, but as Jude opened the car door to get out, Brennan finally spoke. "Boss, that is 15 years of your life. That is the empire you led, the one you built yourself, even while living in the heavy shadow of your father's legacy." Jude paused with one foot on the pavement and glanced back over his shoulder. "Everything I built," he said, his voice calm but filled with absolute conviction, "is sleeping in an apartment in Dorchester, hugging a stuffed bear named Biscuit." Brennan stared at him for a long moment and then simply nodded. He said nothing more. 3 hours later, Jude had signed everything away. Every document, every transfer, every last agreement. When he walked out of the law office at 2 in the morning, he was no longer the East Coast's most feared crime boss. He was just Jude Kensington, a 36-year-old who owned a legitimate real estate and casino company, and the father to a 4-year-old girl whose first 4 years he had missed. But he did not drive straight to Lena's apartment. He went back to the mansion, walked into his private study, opened a desk drawer, and pulled out a rolled-up tube he had kept hidden for weeks. He had it before the picnic, before he had even allowed himself to hope. They were architectural drawings, the first project he had designed with his own hands since giving up his dream of being an architect 15 years ago. At 3 in the morning, Jude stood outside apartment 312 in the Maple Building in Dorchester. He had dark circles under his eyes. His suit was wrinkled and his tie was loose, and his hair was a mess from running his hands through it all night long. In one hand, he held a stack of transfer documents, and in the other, he had a roll of blueprints. He knocked gently on the door. Lena opened it, her eyes dark from a lack of sleep. She was still in the clothes she had worn all day. It was obvious she had been up, either waiting for him or trying to figure out where she could run. She looked at him, and he looked at her. Then Jude placed the pile of documents on her kitchen table. "Transfer papers," he said. "I signed them. All of the underground businesses have been transferred to a subordinate council. I am completely out. From now on, Kensington Holdings is 100% legitimate. Real estate, casinos, investments, all of it is clean." Lena stared at the papers but did not pick them up. She looked back at him, her eyes still guarded. But underneath that guarded expression, she was fighting to hold back something else. It looked a lot like hope. Jude unrolled the blueprints, spreading the large sheet of paper across her small kitchen table. He had to use a coffee mug and a salt shaker to hold down the edges because the table was not big enough. The design appeared under the flickering fluorescent light. The lines were clean, precise, and beautiful. They showed professional training, but the whole drawing was clearly filled with heart. It was a 2-story brownstone in Brookline, a red brick front. Inside, a studio on the first floor with big, north-facing windows. It is the kind of light that graphic designers can only dream of. On the second floor, there is an art room for a child, with white walls just waiting to be covered in drawings, and a small easel set up by the window. In the backyard, there is a young oak tree and a swing. "My first project," Jude said, his voice softer than it had been all night. "I wanted to be an architect before my father made me into something different. This was the dream I had to bury, and now I am digging it back up." He pointed to the different rooms on the blueprint. "A studio for you, with north light. Exactly what you need for your design work. An art room for Phoebe. White walls so she can hang up all her pictures. A backyard with a swing. Because last week she asked me why our house does not have one." "Jude, I am not trying to buy your love with a house," he said quickly, as if he was worried she would get the wrong idea. "This is a promise. It is a promise that I am ready to rebuild everything from the very beginning. A clean start, with no shadows, no criminal world. Just me, you, and Phoebe." Lena looked at the drawing. Her fingers gently followed the lines of the studio, where he had even sketched in a desk and a wide window. Then her hand moved to the little art room, where he had placed model Phoebe's easel in the exact spot where the light would be the best. Her hand was shaking. "Do you have any idea what I am most afraid of?" she asked in a whisper. "It is not being poor. I have been poor my whole life, and I made it through. It is not being alone. I have been alone my entire life, and I am still here." She looked up at him then, her eyes glistening but not shedding any tears. "The thing I am most afraid of is not belonging anywhere. All my life I have gone from one foster home to another, from one rented room to the next. I have never had a place that felt like home. No one has ever looked at me and said, 'You belong here,' and really meant it." Jude took a slow, gentle step toward her, the same way he had approached Phoebe when they first met, making sure to give her space to back away if she wanted to. She did not move. "You belong here," he said, his voice deep and sure, but also trembling just a little. "Both of you belong here." Lena looked at him, at his gray-blue eyes that were dark from a night without sleep. She looked at his wrinkled suit from spending hours in a law office signing away his entire empire, and at the blueprint for a house that was drawn from a dream he had held onto for 15 years. Then she took a step forward and laid her hand on his chest, right over the inside pocket where the coaster with her name on it had been for the last 5 years. She could feel his heart pounding under her palm. The mafia boss, the architect, the father of her child. He was the man who had torn down a kingdom for a little 4-year-old girl and for the woman he had always loved. After 5 years, their first kiss was barely there. It was just a hint of breath on breath, a soft brush of lips against lips, so shaky and unsure, like they were checking to see if a shattered connection could ever be whole again. But then, the kiss grew more certain, more powerful, and 5 years of isolation, 5 years of rage, and 5 years of love hidden under protective layers all dissolved right there. It happened in that little kitchen, lit by a buzzing fluorescent bulb, between the closing documents and the plans for a house they dreamed of. When they finally broke apart, their eyes were both glistening with tears. "This means yes, right?" Jude breathed out. Lena gave a true smile, her first in a very long time. No more guards up, no more barriers. It was just her. "This means we build it together," she replied. Their brownstone in Brookline was finished one morning in late fall, just as the final leaves on the maples shifted from a brilliant red to a deep copper color. Its red brick front seemed to shine with warmth in the soft sun. The big windows mirrored the perfectly blue sky. In the backyard, a young oak tree clung to its last few golden leaves, almost as if it wanted to greet the new family with its best colors before the winter came. Phoebe was the first one inside. She paused right in the entrance hall, clutching Biscuit under her arm, her eyes, so much like her father's, opening so wide they seemed to take up her whole face. A moment later, she let out a scream, the kind of unfiltered, happy sound that only a child can produce. "My room. Mommy. Daddy. Where is my room?" Jude guided her up the stairs. The moment he opened the door to her art room, Phoebe stopped in her tracks. The walls were clean and white. A little easel sat next to the window, perfectly placed to get the morning sun. A brand new box of crayons and a set of watercolors were sitting perfectly on a shelf. And over in the corner was a little wooden bed that Jude had made with his own hands, sized perfectly for a teddy bear. Phoebe's eyes went from the tiny bed to Biscuit and then to her father, and they were sparkling. She gently set Biscuit down on his new bed, tucked the miniature blanket all the way to the bear's chin, and then looked at Jude with all the seriousness a 4-year-old could summon. "Biscuit has his own room now," she declared. Jude knelt down to wrap her in a hug. Lena leaned against the doorframe, watching them. Her hand held the wood tightly because her legs felt unsteady, not from sadness, but because her heart was fuller than it had ever been in her entire 27 years of life. That afternoon, the doorbell chimed. Catherine Kensington was standing on the porch, dressed in a sophisticated light gray suit, her platinum hair styled perfectly as usual. But she was holding something that caught Lena completely by surprise. It was an old silver picture frame, heavy with detailed carvings, obviously a family treasure and not a recent purchase. The picture inside was the one Catherine had organized just a week ago at her estate. It showed Phoebe perched on a green velvet armchair in the grand living room, with Biscuit on her lap. She was smiling, her little dimple visible, in the first formal portrait of a Kensington grandchild. Catherine gave the frame to Lena. After that, she rested her hand on Lena's shoulder. No words were exchanged, none were necessary. The soft weight of her hand was firm enough to be reassuring, yet gentle enough to respect the delicate truce they had been carefully creating for weeks. It said more than any official welcome ever could. Catherine came in and spent an hour with Phoebe in the art room. She showed her how to blend blue and white paints to create clouds, and shared that Jude had also loved painting clouds when he was a boy, because he always said they were the one thing nobody could ever possess. When it was time for Catherine to go, she did not use the front door. Instead, she went through the back garden. She stopped under the small oak tree and looked back at the house one last time. A light was on in a second-floor window, and Phoebe's silhouette danced behind the drapes. The sound of her giggling drifted into the cool fall air. For a long while, Catherine just stood there by herself. The warm glow from the window softened the features of the powerful family leader. And for the first time in a very long time, she smiled. It was a private smile, one that comes when you realize you have finally fixed something after letting things be broken for far too long. Then she turned and walked away, her footsteps barely making a sound on the stone path leading to the rear gate, removing herself from a family portrait that was now perfect without her. Later that evening, after Phoebe's bath, and after she was dressed in the starry pajamas Catherine had given her, Jude picked her up and took her to bed. Phoebe snuggled into her new bed, grabbed Biscuit from his tiny stand to cuddle with, and gazed up at her dad. "Daddy, this is our house? For real?" "Yes, my princess. This is our home for always. For always." A smile touched her lips, showing her dimple, as her heavy, silvery blue eyelids began to drift shut. Soon, her breathing was quiet and even, the deep sleep of a little girl who at last had her very own room, a father, a mother, and a place to call home. Jude watched over her for a good while before he headed downstairs. He carefully unrolled the painting Phoebe had created at Walden Pond. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands next to a lake, with the word family written above them. He hung it in the most visible spot on the living room wall, so it was the very first thing anyone would notice when they came in. Next to it, he set up a small glass frame. Inside was the old, worn-out coaster from Rosie's Cafe. Its edges were soft, the rose design was faint, and on the reverse side, written in slanted blue pen, and now faded by the years, was the name Lena. The coaster was now safe behind glass. For 5 years it had been in his pocket, spent thousands of nights on his nightstand in London, and his thumb had traced her name in the darkness more times than he could count. Now, it had a permanent home. It was no longer a painful reminder or a symbol of what he had lost, but the start of a brand new chapter. Lena was in her first-floor studio, a space Jude had made just for her. She stood by the large, north-facing window, where moonlight streamed in, creating a silver trail on the polished wood floor. With her hand resting on the cool window pane, she gazed out at the backyard, where the new swing swayed softly in the evening wind. Jude walked up behind her and circled her waist with his arms, resting his chin on the top of her head. They stood there quietly in the moonlit room, listening to the breeze outside, the gentle groans of the new house as it settled, and the sound of Phoebe's peaceful breathing coming from the baby monitor Jude had set up that very first day. "We lost 5 years," Lena said softly. Jude held her just a little bit tighter. "But we have a whole lifetime to go," he replied. And so, our story concludes here, in this brownstone in Brooklyn. It is a place where a coaster with Lena's name on it sits behind glass, right next to a child's drawing called Family. It is where a teddy bear named Biscuit has his own bed, and where a man who once ran a criminal organization destroyed his old world to create a home with a swing set for his little girl. And it is where a 27-year-old woman who grew up alone has finally found her own family. Life can be cruel and take a lot from you. It can steal your time, your opportunities, and the ones you hold dear. But sometimes, if you have the courage to love again, the strength to let go of the past, and the patience to trust what people do instead of what they say, amazing things can happen. They might come later than you hoped, but they are never too late. If you were moved by this story, please click the like button to help our channel continue to share tales like this. Please pass this video on to the people you care about, or to anyone who needs a reminder that no matter how difficult things get, love and honesty will always find a way home. Remember to subscribe so you do not miss out on new, heartfelt stories we post every day. We would love to know how this story affected you. Have you ever been separated from someone you love, only to find them again? Or maybe, like Lena, you are still on the path to finding your own special place in the world? Please leave your stories in the comments section. We go through every single one and are eager to learn about what is important to you. To everyone watching, we wish you great health, happiness in your lives, and a sense of calm every single day. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again in our next story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.